There is a room in Washington, D.C., where the truth goes to wait. It is not a dramatic room. The ceiling is low. The fluorescent lights hum at a frequency that makes your teeth ache. There are no windows. The chairs are the kind that tell you without saying anything that comfort was never the point. On the morning of March 14th, 2023, Vice Admiral Gerald Stokes sat at a long mahogany table in that room, his uniform pressed to a crease so sharp it could draw blood, his rows of service ribbons catching the light with every careful breath he took. He was answering questions about Operation Night Watch. He answered them the way men like him always do, slowly, precisely, with the confidence of someone who has told the same story so many times that the story has become in his mind the truth. He spoke about difficult decisions. He spoke about impossible circumstances. He spoke about the fog of war, that convenient phrase that has buried more inconvenient facts than any classified document ever could. The senators nodded. A few of them wrote things down. Cut to a classroom in Meridian Cove, Connecticut, 230 miles north. A different world entirely. The room smells like old wood and rosin. There are music stands arranged in a loose half circle. On the chalkboard, someone has written a fingering chart for a D major scale in chalk that is almost entirely erased. The radiator in the corner ticks and breathes like something alive and deeply unhappy about it. At the upright piano against the far wall sits a young woman. She is 26 years old, 5 feet 3 inches, 119 pounds. Her hair is pulled back with the efficiency of someone who does not think about her hair very often. Her hands rest on the keys, not playing, just resting. And the first thing you would notice about those hands if you were standing in the doorway is how completely still they are. Not the stillness of someone waiting. The stillness of someone who has learned through long practice to make stillness look like nothing at all. Those hands could field strip a Remington M24 in under a minute in complete darkness. Those hands could calculate wind drift and elevation adjustment at 800 meters with a pencil and a piece of paper in under 3 minutes. Those hands had been trained over the course of an entire childhood and adolescence by a man who believed that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take from you, and so he had given his daughter as much of it as she could carry. No one in that classroom knew any of that. No one in Meridian Cove knew any of that. For as long as Nora Harmon had lived in this town, she had been exactly one thing to the people around her: the music teacher. The quiet one. James Harmon's daughter. And that last part followed her like weather. James Harmon had been dead for 18 months when this story begins. He died on a Tuesday, which felt wrong to Nora because her father had never seemed like a man who would choose a Tuesday for anything. He died from complications related to a wound recorded in his medical file as a training injury. It was not a training injury. Nora knew that. The 2 men who visited him in the hospital during his final week knew that. The government knew that. But the paperwork said what the paperwork said, and so that was what it was. What the paperwork also said, what it had said for 9 years since the night of October 4th, 2014, in a mountain pass in eastern Afghanistan, was that Staff Sergeant James Harmon had disobeyed a direct order during a classified extraction operation designated Operation Night Watch, and that his insubordination had contributed directly to the deaths of 3 United States Special Operations personnel: Petty Officer First Class Daniel Rourke, Master Sergeant Thomas Callahan, Staff Sergeant Kevin Webb. 3 men, 3 families, 3 folded flags. The official record did not say what happened to the 4 hostages James Harmon had refused to leave behind. That part stayed classified. But Nora knew. Her father had told her on one of those evenings when the distance between them closed enough for him to say the things he spent most of his life not saying. She knew about the hostages, she knew about the pass, she knew about the night, and she knew who had given the order that her father had refused. Meridian Cove is the kind of small Connecticut coastal town that looks beautiful in photographs and feels to the people who actually live there like a place the rest of the world forgot to include. The harbor smells like brine and diesel. The main street has a diner open since 1962 and a hardware store that will probably close next year. In the summer, tourists come for the sailboats. In the winter, the population drops by half and the wind comes off the water like a judgment. Nora had grown up here. Left for college, came back when her father got sick, and then stayed because leaving felt like a betrayal she could not name precisely enough to argue against. She taught music at the middle school on Clement Street, piano cello basic theory. She was good at it, not in the way that gets you noticed, but in the quiet, patient way that means something to a 12-year-old who has been told she has no talent and suddenly finds herself playing a piece she believed was impossible. Nora had a gift for that, for finding the thing a person needed to hear that no one had bothered to tell them yet. There was a boy in her Thursday afternoon cello group named Elliot who had been told by his previous teacher that he had no ear for music. He had been told this at age 9. He was now 12 and he still played every note with the braced apologetic quality of someone who expects to be wrong. She was working on that. It was the kind of problem that required patience rather than technique, and patience was something she had in considerable supply. There was also Marcus 13 violin first chair, who had the instincts of someone who would be remarkable later if the right things were in place now. He watched her sometimes with the particular attention of a young person, trying to understand an adult who does not behave the way adults usually behave, and she did not mind being watched. She had grown up being watched and had learned to move inside it without letting it change her. Her house was a 2-story wood frame on Aldrich Road, 3 blocks from the water. Her father had bought it when she was 4 between deployments, trying as he always was to build something that felt like a permanent life. The house needed work when he bought it, and it needed work now. Nora had learned to do most of it herself. He had taught her that too, along with everything else. On the shelf in her bedroom, between a stack of music theory textbooks and a photograph of her parents taken somewhere in Colorado in the early 90s, there was a metal box, approximately the size of a hardcover novel, locked. The key hung on a cord around Nora's neck, where it had been since the night her father pressed it into her hand and told her 2 things. The first, do not open this until you have no other choice. The second was harder to summarize. It was about the day he believed would come, what to do when it arrived, and how to trust herself when it did. She had understood the instruction without needing it spelled out. She had been understanding it in different ways her entire life. Ray Dowell lived next door. He had moved in about 3 years ago, not long after Nora came back to take care of her father. He was 62 years old, lean in a way that was not thin, with hands larger than they needed to be, and eyes that moved through a room the way Nora's eyes moved through rooms, registering, cataloging, settling into a kind of watchful quiet that most people never notice because it looks so much like ordinary stillness. He drove a 1994 Ford pickup maintained with precision, most people reserve for things considerably more expensive. He mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings. He brought Nora's trash cans back from the curb on collection days without being asked. If you had asked anyone in the neighborhood what they knew about Ray Dowell, they would have told you retired, keeps to himself, good neighbor, quiet. None of them knew he held a chief warrant officer classification redacted from his service record. None of them knew he had flown rotary wing aircraft in support of operations that did not appear in any public database. None of them knew that on the night of October 4th, 2014, he had been in the air above a mountain pass in eastern Afghanistan, and that from his altitude, he had seen things no subsequent investigation had ever asked him to describe. Nora's father had known all of that. Before he died, James Harmon made one phone call Nora did not learn about until much later. He called Ray Dowell. He asked for one thing, not to protect Nora, because James Harmon knew his daughter did not need protecting in the way most people mean that word. What he asked was simpler and harder. He asked Ray to be close, to be present, to be there when the day came that required a witness. Ray said yes. Then he rented the house next door and started mowing his lawn on Saturday mornings. The letter from Naval Station Meridian arrived on a Friday in February. It was addressed to the music department of Meridian Cove Middle School, politely worded in the way official communications are when they want something from you, but need it to feel like an honor. The base was hosting a ceremony on March 22nd to commemorate the 9th anniversary of Operation Night Watch and to honor the naval special warfare community. The school orchestra had been identified as a potential performing group. The event would be attended by senior naval officials and several private donors with a history of supporting educational programs. The potential donation to the arts program was listed at the bottom, $10,000. The principal called Nora into his office that afternoon. She read the letter standing, which was how she read most things, twice. Then she set it on his desk and looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment. $10,000. The program had been running on a budget that required her to buy her own rosin and replace broken strings out of pocket. 3 of her students had genuine ability, the kind that deserved better instruments than the school could provide. Elliot deserved a better instrument, the kind that deserved to keep going when the funding ran out. She told the principal she would think about it. That evening, carrying groceries from her car, she found Ray on his porch with his coffee. She told him about the letter. Not all of it. The relevant part. He was quiet for a moment. He looked toward the harbor, visible from his porch in winter, when the trees were bare. Then, without turning around, Stokes will be there. Nora set her groceries down on the porch steps. How do you know that? Ray wrapped both hands around his mug. I flew for him. Once. He did not say anything else. The screen door closed behind him with the sound screen doors make in February, tight sealed against the cold. Nora stood on her porch for a long time. The water was dark. The lights of the harbor broke apart in it with every small wave. She thought about two promises she had made. One to a man who was gone. One to a woman who had moved away and started over, which was its own kind of gone. Both built around the same core. Do not go looking for this. Do not carry the fight to the people who started it. But this was not looking for it. This was a letter. This was a school orchestra. This was a check with enough zeros to keep her students playing music for 2 more years. She went inside and called the principal back. She told him she would go. March 22nd was cold the way March in Connecticut is cold, not the honest cold of January, but the cold of a season that cannot commit, that gives you 40 degrees by noon and takes it back by 3. The bus to Naval Station Meridian left at 7:45. 14 students with instrument cases. 2 chaperones. Nora in the front seat with a thermos of coffee and the silence around her that her students had learned over months of knowing her to leave alone. The metal box was in the inside pocket of her coat. She had put it there that morning without deciding to the way you sometimes do things that have been decided below the level of conscious thought. The base checkpoint was thorough. The guard processing Nora's license paused a half-second longer than the others. She did not react. Her students pressed their faces to the bus windows with the curiosity of children who have not yet learned to be unimpressed by things. Nora watched the base layout as the bus moved through it. She noted building positions relative to each other. She noted road directions. She did these things the way she breathed without deciding to. Hangar 6 had been converted for the ceremony. Folding chairs faced a raised platform draped in navy blue. Flags hung from the rafters. Along the walls, display boards showed sanitized photographs and carefully written descriptions of SEAL operations from the past decade. The names Rourke, Callahan, and Webb appeared on one board. Under each name, a photograph. Under each photograph, 2 lines that said almost nothing true. Nora read those 2 lines for each of them. Then she found a position at the back of the hangar near the emergency exit with a clear sight line to the platform. The room filled, officers in dress uniforms, civilians in dark suits, a cluster of men near the left wall who wore no insignia but stood in a way that communicated everything, the particular stillness that does not come from comfort but from long training in managing the distance between what you feel and what you show. Nora recognized that kind of stillness. She lived in it. She was watching the platform when she became aware that someone was watching her. Not the ambient awareness of a crowd, specific directed attention. She let 4 seconds pass. Old habit. Then she turned her head slowly to the left. Commander Lisa Brennan was 42 years old with the build of someone who still ran before sunrise and the expression of someone who had spent a career noticing what other people missed. She was in dress uniform positioned near the center aisle, and she was watching Nora with the quiet professional focus of someone constructing a picture from incomplete information. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Then Admiral Stokes walked onto the platform, and Nora's attention moved. Gerald Stokes was 58 years old and looked like the version of himself that appeared in official photographs, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the kind of face that photographs well from any angle. He wore his uniform like a second skin, like something that had become so much a part of his physical presence that removing it would be a diminishment. He stepped to the podium and let the room settle before speaking. Make them wait. Make them feel the weight of your presence before you give them the words. Nora recognized the technique. He spoke about service, about sacrifice, about men and women operating in spaces where the world is most dangerous, doing things the public would never know about, protecting freedoms most people take for granted. He had clearly given this speech before, and he gave it well with the cadence and pauses that make a room feel like it is sharing something true. He spoke about Operation Night Watch. He said it had been one of the most difficult decisions of his career. He said the circumstances were unlike anything his command had faced before. He said the operation had ultimately succeeded in its core mission objectives. He used those exact words, core mission objectives, and that while it had come at a devastating cost, the men lost had died in service to something larger than any single operation, any single command decision. He did not say their names. Rourke, Callahan, Webb. He said the men lost. He did not say their names. Nora counted her breaths, ribs against the inside of her coat, hands at her sides, the technique her father had given her when she was 9 years old, sitting on the back porch in summer, learning things she had not understood the purpose of until much later. The orchestra performed after the speeches. Her students were good. They had practiced hard, and they played with the focused energy of young people who understand that the stakes are real. The piece was Barber's Adagio for strings, Nora's choice made months ago without fully admitting to herself why. She knew now. The music moved through the hangar the way that piece always does, not triumphant, not romantic, but honest in the way very few things are honest. It says what it says directly and without evasion, that loss is real, that it accumulates, that it does not resolve the way we want it to. Several people in the audience looked at the floor. Nora watched Gerald Stokes. He stood near the refreshment table on the right side of the room, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and for approximately 12 seconds, he looked like a man who had been reminded of something he worked very hard not to think about. Then the expression closed, and he became again the version of himself from the photographs. After the applause, the room broke into the informal circulation of a reception. Nora moved toward her students. She told them they had played well. She meant it. She helped two of them break down instruments and reminded Marcus about the bus departure time. She was 4 steps from the exit when she heard Stokes speaking behind her. He was addressing the principal, complimenting the performance, doing the thing men in his position do at events like this when they need to justify their attendance to themselves. Nora kept moving. Then, "Is this the director?" She stopped. Not because she had to, because something in that question, the particular weight of his voice when he asked it, told her that stopping was the right decision, that moving would be the wrong one. When the situation changes, you assess before you act. She turned. Stokes looked at her with the polite evaluative interest of a man accustomed to quick assessments. The principal turned toward her with the reflexive helpfulness of someone wanting everyone to get along. "Nora Harmon," the principal said. "She runs our music program." "Outstanding work," Stokes said. He smiled the way senior officers sometimes smile at people they consider less important, warm enough to be cordial, calibrated enough to communicate distance. "Do you have a connection to the military? You're here in an interesting role for a civilian." "My father served," Nora said. "What branch?" "Navy." Something shifted in his expression, barely the way the surface of deep water shifts when something moves far below. "What was his name?" 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Nora Harmon made the calculation she had been building toward without knowing she was building toward it since the letter arrived in February. Since she was 9 years old on a back porch learning things without being told why. "Harmon," she said. "James Harmon." The shift this time was not subtle. Stokes moved through something, quickly recognition, calculation, and then a decision. A man in his position had options in a moment like this. He could have acknowledged the name quietly and moved away. He could have offered a measured word and ended the conversation. He had decades of practice managing the things he did not want to face. Instead, he chose the option that men sometimes choose when they are afraid, which is to attack. He turned slightly, just enough to address the small group gathered in the natural circulation of the reception, and spoke in a voice calibrated to carry. "Harmon." He let the name sit for a moment. "I remember that name. I imagine it's not an easy one to carry." He said it with the particular gentleness of someone being cruel in a way they can later describe as concern. "Your father was involved in an operation under my command. A difficult situation. Some decisions were made that well. The families always bear the weight of those things. Is it hard being here?" Around them, the small pocket of the room that could hear this exchange went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that people are not sure they should be watching. Nora was very still. "We lost 3 extraordinary men," Stokes continued, his voice taking on the quality of a performance. "Men who would still be here if different choices had been made that night. By different people." He looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry for whatever version of the story you grew up with. I'm sure he told you what he needed to tell you." Marcus was watching from 10 feet away. She could see him in her peripheral vision. Commander Brennan had moved through the room and now stood 12 feet away, watching everything with the attention of someone who does not want to miss a single detail. Stokes spread his hands in a gesture of false openness. Sometimes they don't give them call signs. Not every role warrants one. He turned briefly to the people around him, gathering them in, making them witnesses. "What was your father's call sign if he had one?" A ripple of laughter, uncomfortable and voluntary. Nora heard it. She thought about Rourke, Callahan, Webb. 3 names on a display board. 3 families. 9 years with a version of events that was not true. She thought about the key on the cord around her neck, about the metal box in her coat pocket locked and waiting. She looked at Gerald Stokes, not at his uniform, Not at his ribbons, at the man behind the performance of the face, at the things she could see there that he did not know she could see. She let the room get very quiet. Then she said one word, quietly, precisely, without drama or effort, in the same tone she used when she corrected a student's fingering in the middle of a lesson. Wraith. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a room that has just heard something it did not expect and cannot immediately process. To Nora's left, three senior SEAL officers standing together near the display boards took one simultaneous step backward. Not a dramatic step. A small involuntary step, the physical response that happens before the conscious mind has time to intervene. Near the far wall, Ray Dowell, who had arrived separately, who had told Nora only that he wanted to be present, closed his eyes. He did not open them for a long moment. Commander Brennan, 12 feet away, raised one hand and covered her mouth. Her other hand found the edge of the display board beside her. In the back of the room, an older man with the bearing of someone who had served a very long time and spent the years since carrying it quietly said something under his breath. The people near him heard it. It moved outward through the room in a wave. Lord, she's Wraith's daughter. Gerald Stokes stood completely still. The color left his face with the thoroughness of something that cannot be controlled or managed or performed away. For the first time since he had walked onto that platform, for possibly the first time in many years, Gerald Stokes looked exactly like what he was. A man who had done something that could not be undone. And Nora Harmon stood in front of him, 119 pounds, 26 years old, her hands at her sides, and she watched him understand that the day he had believed would never come had arrived. Not dramatically, not with the force he might have prepared for. Just a word. One word. Her father's name in the field, spoken by his daughter in a room full of people who knew exactly what it meant. She had not gone looking for this. She had come for $10,000 and the chance to keep 14 children playing music. But she was here, and now there was no other choice. The word hung in the air above the room, the way certain words do not, fading, not dispersing, but holding its shape, its weight, while the people beneath it tried to understand what had shifted. Gerald Stokes recovered first, or tried to. He drew himself up, let 2 seconds pass. Then he did what he had done in difficult briefing rooms and congressional hearings. He took control of his own face, straightened the story behind his eyes, and spoke. I understand this is emotional for you, he said, his voice measured, almost gentle. Your father's service was complicated. That's a hard thing to inherit, but making accusations in a public forum in front of active duty personnel. I haven't made any accusations, Nora said. Simply, not defiantly, the way you state a fact about the weather. Stokes paused for a fraction of a second. You implied, I said my father's call sign, you asked for it. Around them, the room had organized itself without being directed the way rooms do when something important is happening and people sense it before they understand it. A loose circle had formed. Officers, civilians, several of Nora's students who had stopped packing instruments without quite realizing they had stopped. Brennan had not moved from her position. She was building a picture and she was not going to interrupt it. Stokes tried a different angle. The operation you seem to be referring to is classified at a level that makes any public discussion of it inappropriate at best and potentially a federal matter at worst. He let that last phrase land like a door closing. I would strongly encourage you. I have a recorder, Nora said. The room went very quiet again. A different quality of quiet. The held breath quiet of people who understand that what they are about to hear will matter. Stokes went still in the way that controlled people go still when something they believed was contained turns out not to be. My father kept a voice recorder, Nora said. Personal habit, not part of his issued equipment. Encrypted. It was with his personal effects when he died. It contains audio logs from the night of Operation Nightwatch. She let that exist for a moment, including the communication he received from the command post in Qatar approximately 22 minutes before his team reached the designated extraction point. No one spoke. Then Brennan took 3 steps forward. What kind of logs? Nora looked at her, at the set of her jaw, at the way she was holding the space between them. She decided. Real time, his own voice, the communications he received, the sounds of the environment. A pause. And the precise gap between the threat assessment acknowledgement and the proceed order. Brennan said, I'd like to see the recorder. That's impossible, Stokes said. The word came out before he could stop it. The wrong word. Too quick, too definite. The word of a man who knows exactly what is on that recorder and is afraid of it. Nora looked at him when he said it, and the look was enough. I'd like to see the recorder, Brennan said again, not asking Stokes, speaking to Nora directly. Nora said, all right. Stokes moved then, not physically, but in the way that men with institutional power move when they feel it being questioned. He straightened, gathered himself, addressed Brennan with the blunt directness of someone invoking rank. Commander, this individual is a civilian with no clearance and no standing in a secure installation. She is making unverified claims about a classified operation. I would expect you to, with respect, sir, Brennan said, and the with respect was doing a great deal of work. If she has audio evidence related to a classified operation, the appropriate response is to examine that evidence, not to dismiss it. She doesn't have anything. She has a story her father told her and a recorder that may contain whatever she claims. Then examination will establish that, Brennan said. From the back of the room near the emergency exit, a man's voice said, she has more than that. Everyone turned. Ray Dowell had made his decision. He moved across the hangar floor without hurry, without announcement, with the complete assurance of a man who knows exactly where he is going and will not be persuaded away from it. He stopped at the edge of the circle and looked at Gerald Stokes, and the look was the kind that only two people who share specific knowledge can exchange a look with, years in it, in a specific night, in a specific mountain pass. Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Dowell, he said, not to the room, to Stokes specifically. Rotary Wing, Night Watch. I was on station above the extraction point from 2340 to 0110. I had direct visual for 47 minutes. The silence in the room became absolute. Stokes looked at Dowell for a long moment. Something moved through his face recognition, and beneath it something older, closer to the feeling you get when you have believed for years that a particular door was permanently sealed, and you discover it was never locked at all. You were ordered to stand down, Stokes said. I was, Dubel said. You signed documents under a classification structure that precluded me from volunteering information, Dubel said. Even, factual, the voice of someone delivering a report. I was never asked. In 9 years, no investigation, no inquiry, no review ever contacted me. He held Stokes' eyes steadily. I had direct visual of that extraction point. I saw what was there before James Harmon's team arrived. Brennan had her phone out. She was making a call, stepping half a step sideways while keeping her eyes on the exchange. One of the senior SEAL officers near the wall, a man in his mid-50s whose face had had a great deal asked of it, said something to the man beside him, too low for most of the room to catch. But Nora was close enough. What she caught was confirmed. He was there. I know his file. Stokes turned toward the officer. He was beyond his management now, and the knowledge of it showed on his face despite everything he had built over 31 years. He turned back to Nora and made one more attempt. You have no idea what you're doing, he said, and for the first time there was no performance in it. Just a man speaking plainly to someone he believed had not thought through the consequences. I know exactly what I'm doing, Nora said. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and removed the metal box. She held the key on the cord at her neck and looked at the box for a moment. She had not opened it since her father died. She had carried it here this morning because she had known in the part of herself that knows things before the rest catches up that this was the day. She opened it. The recorder was smaller than a deck of cards. Black composite casing, no brand markings, a port at one end. Her father had kept it for years, long before Night Watch. It was a personal system encrypted, and the key for the encryption was the date of her mother's birthday, which James had told her in those last weeks, along with the specific details she would need if the day came. The day had come. She held it out to Brennan, who took it with both hands, turned it over once, then crossed to the NCIS technical officer who had been standing near the entrance, a young man who had arrived with the official party and who had spent the last several minutes hoping for clear instructions. Brennan spoke to him in a low voice. He nodded and moved toward his equipment case. Below where the recorder had rested, two other things remained in the open box. The first was a small coin. She had seen it before, found it once as a child in the small box on her father's dresser, where he kept his watch, and he had shown it to her briefly and told her it came from a family he had helped, that keeping it was his way of remembering what the work was actually for. She held it in her palm for a moment, heavier than it looked. Then she slipped it into her coat pocket, where its weight settled against her hip like something that had always belonged there. The second was a white envelope, her name on the front in her father's handwriting, which she recognized the way you recognize the specific weight of a voice, not just its sound, but the quality of its presence, the feeling of being in its range. She opened it. Her father's handwriting was the same as it had always been. Deliberate, exact, slightly forward-leaning. He had written in ink, not his usual pencil, and the use of ink told her something about the intention behind these words. These were not notes, these were the final version of something thought about for a long time. Nora, if you are reading this, then the day came. I always believed it would. Not because I wanted it to, but because I know who Stokes is, and men like that eventually create the conditions for their own reckoning. I wanted to be the one there when it happened. I am sorry I am not. I need to tell you something about the two promises you made, the one to me and the one to your mother. You have kept both of them faithfully, and I know what that has cost you. The promise to your mother was about your safety. She needed to know you would not put yourself in danger without reason. That was a promise worth keeping, and I ask you to keep believing that. The promise to me was different. I never asked you to stay silent forever. I asked you not to go looking. There is a difference between going looking and being found by the thing you have tried not to look for. If you are in a room with Stokes and there is no other way out, say my name. Not for me. I have made my peace with all of it in the way a man can make peace with things that were right even when they cost him everything. Say it for Daniel Rourke, for Thomas Callahan, for Kevin Webb. Their families have lived 9 years with a version of the story that is not true. That is the weight I have never been able to put down. The recorder has what you need. Dowell has what you need, and you are more prepared for this than you know. I made sure of it. Trust yourself. I taught you everything I know. That has always meant more than the technical things. It means I trust your judgment. It means I trust what you are made of. Come home safe. She folded the letter once, put it back in the envelope, stood with it in both hands for a moment. Then she crossed the room to where Brennan stood with the technical officer who had connected the recorder to a device in his equipment case and was working through the decryption with focused efficiency. She held out the envelope. My father wrote this 6 weeks before he died. It's relevant. Brennan read the letter standing up. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something settled in it. The expression of a person who has been carrying a question for a long time and has just been handed a piece of an answer. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Thank you. A pause with something specific in it. He sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was the most capable person I've ever known, Nora said. Across the room, Stokes was speaking in a low-controlled voice to two officers who were clearly not allies, so much as witnesses he was attempting to recruit. His body language had contracted into something tighter, more defensive. The expansive command presence of the morning was gone. From the expressions of the officers he was addressing, it was not working. One of the two men in civilian clothes had introduced himself to Brennan. Nora caught the exchange. NCIS, Inspector General's office. The second man had a recorder of his own and wrote in a small notebook with the shorthand speed of someone who does this for a living. Dowell appeared at Nora's shoulder. He said nothing for a moment, just stood beside her, the way he stood on his porch in the mornings, not requiring anything, simply present. He asked you to be close, Nora said. Not a question. Few months before he died. Called me, said he'd thought about it for a long time, and this was the only ask he was going to make. He didn't tell me. He knew you. Something in Ray's voice that was almost a smile, though his expression did not change. Knew if he told you, you'd have spent the last year and a half trying to tell me not to bother. He looked at the far wall. He was protecting your ability to be surprised. What did you see, Nora said, that night? Dowell was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the precision of someone releasing something kept inside for a very long time. I was on station above the extraction point, 47 minutes of visual. Valley floor between two ridge lines, eastern Afghanistan, approximately 60 kilometers from the Kunar province border. At 23:52, I identified a prepared position on the eastern ridge. Military bearing deliberate placement fields of fire oriented on the extraction point. He paused. They were waiting, not patrolling, not moving through, positioned and waiting. I called it up. What did they tell you? Stand by. 11 minutes later, I received orders to reduce altitude and prepare for extraction. Standard protocol, as if the position I'd reported did not exist. He looked at the floor. James's team reached into the extraction point at 0017. The ambush initiated at 0019. 2 minutes. Between arrival and ambush. If Dowell's report had been acted on, if the extraction point had been changed, if the order from Qatar had contained something different. Rourke, Callahan, Webb. Nora breathed, slow and deliberate, hands open at her sides. The technical officer's voice carried across the room. Commander Brennan. Everyone turned. He had the recorder connected to a tablet screen, a waveform displayed with a timeline along the bottom. Two segments flagged in yellow. Brennan crossed to him. Nora followed. So did both investigators. The technical officer spoke quietly, directed primarily to Brennan. Two significant segments. First is timestamped October 4th, 2014 at 23:38. Second runs from 008 through 0031. Metadata intact and unaltered. The encryption key was applied at time of original recording. This is not a file added to afterward. He played the first segment. James Harmon's voice came through the small speaker with the texture of audio recorded in a field environment, slight compression, ambient sound underneath it, the unorchestrated quality of something real. He was reciting position and status in the clipped shorthand of an operator in the field. And then cutting through the ambient noise, a different voice processed formal, the voice of someone at a command post relaying through protocol delivering a message. The message referenced the extraction point by its grid coordinate. It referenced potential compromise to route security. It noted elevated threat assessment in the target vicinity. It had come through the command post in Qatar. It had been acknowledged. And then 11 minutes later, on the same recording, the standard proceeded order. Same extraction point, same grid, no adjusted route, no alternative objective. Proceed. The room was extremely quiet. Brennan looked at the timestamp, looked at the technical officer, 22 minutes. From the threat assessment acknowledgement to the proceed order, he confirmed, 22 minutes. The second segment played. Nora had not heard her father's voice in 18 months, and it arrived below language, below decision, somewhere in the foundational material of who she was. His voice was calm. He was reporting contact, reporting men down, 2 then 3, reporting the hostages secure. And then over the sounds of the engagement, sounds unmistakable for anything other than what they were. His voice delivered the words that had been in the official record for 9 years as evidence of insubordination. I am not leaving them. Clear, unhurried, certain. Not the voice of a man who had lost control. The voice of a man who had assessed a situation completely and made a decision he had already committed to living with. Nobody in the circle spoke for a long moment after the audio ended. The senior SEAL officer near the wall looked directly at Gerald Stokes and said nothing. He did not need to. Stokes stood at the edge of the circle. He had listened with the face of a man calculating extremely quickly and finding that the numbers will not work in any configuration he can use. The performance was entirely gone. What remained was a face and a man behind it, confronting a thing he had successfully avoided for 9 years. The device may have been altered, he said. Metadata is intact, Brennan said. That can be falsified. By a 26-year-old music teacher who acquired the device 18 months ago at her father's death. The first NCIS investigator said it without emphasis, writing in his notebook as he did. Stokes looked around the circle. He was looking for the exit that was not there. I want this installation cleared. This event is over. With respect, sir, Brennan said. This is now a preliminary investigation. The installation will remain as it is until these individuals have provided initial statements. I am the senior officer present. You are a subject of inquiry, sir. The phrase was procedural, correct, and precise as a scalpel. That changes the chain of command in this specific context. A long silence. Stokes looked at Nora. She met his eyes. She was not angry, not triumphant. She had not come for either of those things. She held his eyes and let him see that there was nothing in her face he could use. He looked away first. Brennan guided Nora to one side of the room and spoke quietly. I need to tell you something. 6 years ago, I was working a review of communication protocols from that period. I identified 2 SIGINT anomaly signals intelligence flags that I believe were relevant to an incident in eastern Afghanistan in October of 2014. She looked at the far wall. I flagged them through proper channels. I was told the matter was resolved and classified above my clearance level. I was told to move on. Nora waited. I moved on, Brennan said, because that's what you do. Because you trust the system you're inside of, and you tell yourself that the people above you have access to information you can't see, and that their decision was based on something you don't know. She turned to look at Nora directly. I have not stopped thinking about those 2 flags. Not for 1 week in 6 years. She held Nora's gaze. Your father's recorder, Dowell's testimony, my 2 flags, 3 independent sources, the same 22-minute window, the same grid coordinate, the same decision not to act on the information. She let that settle. This doesn't resolve tonight, you understand that. This is the beginning of a process. I know, Nora said. Brennan studied her for a moment. What did he teach you? besides the music. Nora thought about the state park on weekends. The garage in winter with the space heater running, her father's voice patient and exact, teaching her things with the same completeness he gave everything unhurried, believing fully that what he was passing on would matter. Everything he knew, she said. Brennan held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, small, definite, and turned back to the room. Nora put her hand in her coat pocket and held the coin. Its weight was the same as it had always been. She did not know yet the full story of where it came from. There was still the rest of it, the hostages, the family, the people her father had made his choice for. She would learn it. There was time now. Across the room, Marcus had finally finished packing his violin and was watching her with the expression of a child who has witnessed something he does not entirely understand but knows was important. She crossed to him and told him he had played well today. He looked at her for a moment. "Miss Harmon, was that your dad they were talking about?" "Yes." "Is he a hero?" She thought about the word, the way people use it, the way it gets applied to the surface of things without always reaching what's underneath. "He was a man who made a decision," she said, "a hard one, and he didn't run from it." Marcus thought about that. "That sounds like a hero to me." She did not correct him. The investigation did not move the way investigations move in stories. It moved the way real things move, with friction, with reversals, with the grinding patience required of anyone waiting for something that matters more than their own comfort. Nora went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold. The house was very quiet. It was always quiet, but the quality of it had changed, not emptier, but differently weighted, as if the space occupied for years by something unspoken had been cleared and was not yet filled by whatever would come next. She had given her initial statement to the NCIS investigator before leaving the base. 40 minutes. Careful questions, careful answers. Brennan had walked her and her students to the bus. At the door, she put her hand briefly on Nora's arm, not a gesture of comfort, exactly more the gesture of one person acknowledging another across a shared understanding, and said, "Give it time." Ray Dowell's porch light was on when she got home. She sat in her car and looked at it, then went inside and did not knock on his door. What they had both done that day did not require an immediate conversation. They had been ready for it for different lengths of time and for different reasons, and it was enough that it had been done. She slept better that night than she had in 18 months. The calls began the following week. Brennan twice with updates in the careful language of someone navigating a process that had not yet clarified its shape. The NCIS investigator, once with 2 follow-up questions about chain of custody, a number she did not recognize, which turned out to be a lawyer from the Judge Advocate General's office, explaining her rights and potential obligations as a civilian material witness. She listened, asked 2 questions, thanked him, and went back to teaching. She taught her classes. She corrected fingering and talked about breath support. On Thursday afternoon, she worked again with Elliot on the passage that had been eluding him for 3 weeks. Not the technical problem, which was solvable, but the thing behind the technical problem, which was that he was still waiting to be told he was wrong. She did not tell him he was right. She simply stopped correcting him and let him play, and somewhere in the middle of the passage something shifted, and he played it the way it was supposed to be played, and he looked up at her with an expression of surprise, so genuine it was almost painful. She told him, "You knew how to do that. You just needed to stop arguing with yourself." He thought about that for a moment. Then he played it again, and it was better the second time. Ray came over on a Thursday evening with a 6-pack of beer he had not been asked to bring. They sat at her kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about things they had not talked about before. He told her about Night Watch in more detail than he had allowed himself to tell anyone in 9 years. The specific weight of those 47 minutes on station, the call he made and the response he received, the order to stand by and the silence afterward, which he had spent a decade interpreting and reinterpreting without resolution. He told her what he had seen from the air at 0017 when James Harmon's team reached the extraction point and the ambush initiated. He said it plainly without drama, as facts that existed and could not be changed, only acknowledged. She told him about the letter. She read him the parts that mattered and watched his face while she did, and what she saw was the expression of someone hearing confirmed what they had suspected but had never been permitted to know. Before he went back to his side of the fence, he said, "Your father asked me to be close because he wanted you to have a witness. I want you to know I would have been close anyway. When a man does what he did and pays what he paid, you don't forget it. You just don't." He went home. Nora washed the beer bottles and stood at the kitchen window looking at the dark harbor. She was her father's daughter. She had always been. She just had not been allowed until now to be it out loud. The investigation moved through March and into April. 3 days after the ceremony, Stokes was relieved of his command pending review. The announcement was brief and institutional and said nothing specific, which was the language of bureaucracies protecting themselves while the larger process continued. Brennan's 2 SIGINT flags raised 6 years ago and set aside were pulled from the archive and formally incorporated into the inquiry. Dowell's testimony was recorded in a classified deposition running 3 hours and covering everything he had seen and reported and been ordered not to discuss. The recorder's contents were authenticated by a forensic signals laboratory under contract to the Inspector General's office. Metadata intact. Encryption applied at time of original recording. Audio unaltered. The 22-minute window confirmed by cross-reference with command post communications logs from Qatar, which had been in a sealed archive for 9 years, in which no prior review had ever requested, because no prior review had known to ask. No one had known to ask because the people who could have told them had been silenced in one way or another. Dowell by classification and ordered silence. James Harmon by the terms of his exit from service. The families of the fallen by grief, which does not always leave room for sustained investigation. The truth had been managed not by dramatic suppression, but by the careful, patient absence of inquiry. The recorder made inquiry unavoidable. On the morning of April 3rd, Gerald Stokes appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee in closed session. The testimony lasted 4 hours and 15 minutes. Nora did not watch it. She was teaching her Thursday afternoon cello group when it happened, working with Elliot on the passage that had finally opened up for him, listening to the difference between the way he played it now and the way he had played it 3 weeks ago. Brennan called her that evening, said 3 words the logs held. That was enough. Stokes offered, through his legal representation, an alternative interpretation in which the 22-minute window represented reasonable processing time for threat assessment in a high-tempo operational environment. His legal team was experienced, and his argument was not without technical points. But the command post logs were what they were, and Dowell's visual confirmation was what it was, and James Harmon's voice placed him in that pass at 0017, describing conditions entirely consistent with a prepared ambush at a point identified as compromised 22 minutes before he arrived there. The letter from the Pentagon arrived on a Tuesday in late April, addressed to her formally on stationery that made its origin apparent before you read the letterhead. It informed her that a private ceremony was being convened at the Pentagon on May 9th for the purpose of formally correcting the service records of 3 individuals lost in Operation Nightwatch on October 4th, 2014. The families of the deceased had been contacted and had confirmed their intention to attend. Her presence was requested. She read the letter twice at her mailbox. Then she put it in her coat pocket and went inside and sat down at the piano. She played for an hour without stopping, not for technique, not for instruction, just because her hands needed to do something and the piano was there. She played the way she understood certain things needed to be moved through, not around them, straight through, with the knowledge that the other side exists even when you cannot see it. She called her mother that evening. They spoke for 20 minutes. Her mother was living in Phoenix now, remarried 4 years, building a life that Nora had decided some time ago to be genuinely glad for. She told her enough that some things related to her father's service had been reviewed, that certain records were being corrected, that she was all right. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then he always believed that day would come. He used to say it to himself, sometimes late at night, like something he was reminding himself of. Nora said, I know. Her mother said, I'm glad you went to that ceremony, Nora. It was easier than I expected, Nora said, and meant it completely. The drive to Washington on the morning of May 9th was 4 hours in the early light, the highway running through Connecticut into New York and south through New Jersey. Ray drove. She had not asked him to. He had simply said the evening before that he would be there at 5 in the morning. She had not argued. They did not talk much. A country station played low on the radio, and the morning came up through the windshield, and she sat with her hands in her lap and watched the country pass. The Pentagon is not what you imagine if you have not seen it. It is enormous in a way photographs do not convey its scale, so deliberate and complete that it creates its own atmosphere, the seriousness of a place that has absorbed a great deal of history without being diminished by any of it. The security protocols at the entrance were thorough and unhurried. The room where the ceremony was held was on the second floor in a wing requiring an escort from the moment you entered the building. Not a large room. Flags, chairs in precise rows, white flowers on a table along one wall, form of the kind that attend serious occasions without calling attention to themselves. The families were already there. 3 families. The room organized itself around them, without being arranged that way, the way rooms always orient toward the people bearing the most weight. The Rourke family, a woman in her late 50s with two adult sons who had their father's build in their mother's eyes. The Callahan family, an older couple, parents rather than a widow, sitting together with the proximity of two people who have held each other through something for a very long time. And the Webb family, a woman Nora's mother's age, silver-haired, composed in the way that people are composed when composure has been a daily practice for 9 years. Beside her two grown children, a son and a daughter, who sat straight and still and watched the door. Nora knew Margaret Webb immediately. Not from a physical description, her father had described her, by the quality of her grief, worn smooth by 9 years of daily contact, the grief of someone given a wrong story who had lived inside it and could not find her way to the true one. Margaret Webb looked up when Nora entered the room. Something moved between them across the folding chairs and the white flowers and the 9 years of distance, not a communication exactly, but the recognition that two people sometimes experience when they have been connected to each other through someone they both lost and are meeting for the first time. Nora went to her seat. The ceremony began. The Secretary of the Navy spoke first. He was a careful man who chose words with the attention of someone who understands that certain words said in certain rooms become part of a permanent record with consequences beyond their moment of creation. He spoke about the obligation of institutional truth-telling. He spoke about the gap that sometimes opens between the official version of events and the actual events, and about the damage that gap does to families who live inside it. He announced that the service records of Petty Officer First Class Daniel Rourke, Master Sergeant Thomas Callahan, and Staff Sergeant Kevin Webb were being formally corrected, effective immediately. The cause of death was revised in each record from language that had implied negligence on the part of their commanding officer in the field to language that accurately reflected the circumstances that they had been killed in action during a combat engagement at a designated extraction point identified as compromised before their team's arrival in an operation where the order to proceed had been maintained despite that identification. He said each name individually with a full pause between them. Daniel Rourke, Thomas Callahan, Kevin Webb. The room was very still for each one. The Navy Cross was awarded posthumously to each man. The Rourke son came forward, jaw set and eyes wet and unashamed. The Callahan mother received the medal with both hands and held it against her chest for a moment before the aide could step back. The Webb son accepted on behalf of his mother with a nod of thanks so precise and controlled that it communicated everything about what the family had needed to maintain to survive 9 years of the wrong story. Then Commander Brennan stepped forward and read a citation for James Harmon. The language was precise and said plainly for the official record what James Harmon had done on the night of October 4, 2014, that he had received a direct order to abort an extraction in which 4 civilian hostages were secured and 3 of his team members were down, that he had assessed the order as tactically untenable, given the ground conditions, that he had exercised the command judgment available to him under the circumstances, and that the subsequent investigation, which had characterized his decision as insubordination, had been based on an incomplete record that had been incomplete by design. Nora listened with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on the middle distance, and she let the words go into her and settle where they needed to settle. She did not try to decide in real time what she felt about any of it. Some things need to be felt on their own schedule and cannot be hurried without being diminished. Her father had known that too. After the formal ceremony, the room reorganized into the quiet movement of people finding each other. Brennan crossed to Nora and shook her hand with a directness that was its own kind of compliment, not warm exactly, but completely real. Ray was speaking with the Callahan father near the far wall, 2 men of broadly similar generation engaged in the quiet conversation of people who have served and understand what it means to still be here. The Rourke sons approached her together. The older one said, "We spent a long time believing something that wasn't true. I want you to know that what your father did, what you did, that changes something permanent for this family." She thanked him and meant it. She thought about her father's voice on the recorder saying, "I am not leaving them," and she understood that the people he had not left were not only the hostages in the past. She was standing near the table with the white flowers when Margaret Webb came to her. She came alone without her son or daughter, with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided exactly what she is going to do and does not need company for it. She was 61 years old, a small woman. She stood in front of Nora and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then she reached out and took Nora's hands in both of hers. Her hands were warm. She held Nora's hands the way you hold something you have waited a very long time for, with care, and with the knowledge that the waiting is over, and with the complex feeling that the end of waiting does not simply resolve into relief. She said he came back for Kevin. Her voice was steady. She had clearly said this to herself many times in preparation because she was a woman who prepared for things that mattered. He came back for Kevin's body after he was shot the second time. She paused. I needed you to know that I know that. Nora said, I know. He told me. Margaret Webb looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face moved, not breaking, not releasing dramatically, but shifting in the way faces shift. When something held in a particular configuration for a very long time is finally allowed to rest differently. She nodded once, slowly, completely. Then she released Nora's hands and stepped back, and she looked at her with an expression that had clarity in it. Not happiness, not peace exactly, but something that lives on the other side of 9 years of the wrong story when the true story has finally been given its name. She turned and went back to her children. Nora stood at the table for a moment with her hands at her sides. She put one hand in her coat pocket and found the coin, held it without taking it out, thought about what it meant to carry things and what it meant to finally understand what you were carrying them for. Commander Brennan appeared at her shoulder. There's one more thing, she said quietly. Near the entrance to the room where Nora had not noticed them arriving, a man and woman in their 60s stood together, and beside them a young man in his mid-20s. They were dressed carefully formally, and they stood with the watchful attentiveness of people who have learned through experience the importance of reading a room before entering it. The older man was lean with close-cropped gray at his temples, and he moved with the particular steadiness of someone who has rebuilt himself from something very difficult and emerged without bitterness. His name was Khalil Nasir. He was a structural engineer and a professor at the University of Michigan. He had been in this country for 8 years. The woman beside him was his wife. The young man was his oldest son, Adam, in his second year of medical school in Ann Arbor. They had been located by the Inspector General's office as part of the broader case documentation. 4 hostages extracted from the pass on the night of October 4, 2014, now living in the United States under an arrangement that had been part of the classified settlement of the Night Watch matter. They had been contacted and had asked whether they might be permitted to attend. Khalil Nasser crossed the room with the measured pace of a man approaching something important. He stopped in front of Nora and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. I did not know your father's name for many years, he said. His English was precise and careful, the English of a man who has used it professionally for a long time and understands that words carry weight. I did not know his face. I knew him by 2 things: what he did and what he said when I thanked him for it. He paused. He said, I am doing my job. Do not thank me for doing my job. Something moved across Nora's face that she did not try to control. Adam stepped forward and held out an envelope. The paper had a texture worn smooth by years of careful keeping, the texture of something that has been handled often and always gently. No name on the outside, only 2 words in Arabic with a small translation on a strip of paper attached to the back. For the ghost. Nora took it. Khalil said, I wrote this letter the year after we arrived in America. I wrote it to the man who came back for us when he did not have to. I did not know who he was or whether he was still alive. I wrote it because I needed to say the things in it, and there was no other way to say them. My son has been carrying it for 2 years since I gave it to him when he started medical school. I told him, if you ever find the ghost, give him this. He looked at her with the steadiness of someone who has thought about something for a very long time. He knew about you, Khalil said. He mentioned you that night while we were waiting. He said, I have a daughter. She is 1 year old. I think about her when things are difficult. He did not say more than that, but I thought you should know he said it. Nora held the envelope with both hands. She did not trust herself to speak immediately, so she did not. She stood with the letter, and she breathed, and she let what he had told her go to wherever it needed to go, somewhere below language and decisions, somewhere in the foundational material of who she was and where she came from. She looked at Adam. You are in medical school. 2nd year, he said. Surgery if I can manage it. She thought about the night in the pass, about a man ordered to leave who had refused, and the long chain of consequences running forward from a decision made in darkness on a mountain in eastern Afghanistan, running forward all the way to this room, to this young man in his 2nd year of medical school, to the daughter of the man who made the decision, standing here holding a letter addressed to a ghost. He would have been glad to know that, she said. Adam nodded. He had his father's steadiness. Khalil placed his hand briefly on her arm, a formal gesture of acknowledgement that carried more than its brevity suggested, and then he and his wife and son moved away to speak with Brennan, and Nora was left holding the envelope with the 2 Arabic words on the outside and everything they contained. She put it carefully in her coat pocket beside the coin. Ray appeared beside here. He had seen all of it from across the room, and had stayed across the room, which was the right thing to do. He said nothing. He stood beside her and looked at the room at the Rourke family near the flags at Margaret Webb and her children preparing to leave at the Callahans moving through the space in their slow and careful way at Khalil Nasser, shaking Brennan's hand with the precision of a man who knows the value of a handshake. "You all right?" he said. She thought about it the way her father had taught her to think about things, not the reflexive answer that ends the question, but the actual one. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." She was home before the light failed. The harbor was doing what it always did, unchanged and indifferent and exactly right. She made tea. She stood at the window for a long time, holding the cup with both hands, and she let the day settle into wherever days like this one settle. In the morning, she went back to school. Her classroom was exactly as she had left it. Music stands in the half circle, the fingering chart on the chalkboard still mostly erased. The radiator ticking in the corner. The smell of old wood and rosin that she had stopped noticing years ago, and now noticed again the way you notice familiar things after you have been away from them. She set her bag down and opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside, where it had been for 18 months, was a small cloth patch she had taken from her father's belongings on the day she cleared out his things, one of the objects she could not throw away, and had not yet been ready to look at. She picked it up and turned it over once in her hands. The word Wraith in dark thread on worn, backing the kind of insignia that means nothing to most people and everything to the specific few. She placed it back in the drawer face down, not hidden, private. The distinction mattered. Then she took the coin from her coat pocket and set it on the corner of her desk where it sat without announcement, small and specific, catching the morning light coming through the window from the direction of the harbor. She did not label it. She did not explain it. She left it where it was. Her students arrived the way middle schoolers arrive in groups and individually, loud and quiet, trailing backpacks and instrument cases in the ambient energy of people at the age when everything is still in the process of becoming itself. Marcus came in near the end of the group and set up his stand with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough to do it without thinking. He looked at her with the expression he had worn since the ceremony in March, the expression of a child who has witnessed something that has rearranged in a way he cannot yet articulate his understanding of what adults are capable of. She did not address it. She let the room settle, let the instruments be tuned and the stands be adjusted, let the ordinary business of a Thursday afternoon establish itself. Elliot came in last slightly late, slightly apologetic, in the way that he was always slightly apologetic, but less so than 3 weeks ago, she noticed. He set up his cello with a fraction more authority than he had brought to it before, and when he sat down and positioned his bow, he did not have the braced quality of someone expecting to be wrong. She noted it and said nothing about it. She picked up her own cello, not for demonstration, because that was not the point, but because some days the instrument needs to be in your hands for the room to understand what you are asking of it. She positioned her bow. She looked at her students. "The instrument does not respond to force," she said, "only to intention. You have to know what you want to say before you can say it. The music is not in the notes. The notes are just the path." She looked around the room at 14 young faces in various states of attention. "The music is in the decision to follow the path all the way to the end, even when it costs you something. Especially then." She played the opening phrase of the piece they were working on. Not loudly. With the completeness of attention, she had been describing the quality of someone who knows exactly what they mean and says it exactly as they mean it, without flinching and without excess. The sound went out into the room and the students listened. Then she nodded at Elliot. He found the opening note. He drew his bow across the string. He played the phrase not perfectly, not yet, but with something in it that had not been there 3 weeks ago. The braced quality was gone. What replaced it was not confidence, exactly not the showy kind. It was simpler than that. It was the sound of someone who has stopped arguing with himself and started playing. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Nora nodded once. Small, definite. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly it." Elliot looked up. The expression on his face was the same one Marcus wore the day of the ceremony, the expression of someone who has been given information that changes the shape of things, who does not yet have the language for what has changed, but knows something has. She let the moment be what it was, and then she moved on to the next student and the next phrase and the next thing that needed saying. Outside, the May morning was doing what May mornings do in Connecticut, coming up slowly over the harbor, the water gray and silver and alive, the light increasing with the patience of a season that has finally decided to commit. The town moved around the school the way it always had, ordinary, and complete a place the rest of the world might pass by without noticing, which was precisely why it worked as a place to live. On the corner of Nora Harmon's desk, a small coin caught the light and held it. In the bottom drawer, face down, a name that had cost everything and been worth it. At the front of the room, a woman who had been given everything she needed by a man who had understood without needing to say it plainly that what you leave behind matters more than what you are given credit for, that the measure of a life is not the recognition it receives, but the shape it leaves in the people who carry it forward. She played the phrase again, and her students followed. The music filled the room the way good music fills rooms, not imposing itself, not asking to be remembered, simply saying the true thing clearly and trusting that the truth will do what truth does, which is to remain. Long after the sound itself has gone and the people who were present when it was made.